Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought we'd talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening with NATO. It looks like Finland really wants to join. The whole Ukraine thing has had the opposite effect that Vladimir Putin wanted, right, Jim?
Exactly. Not only has it mobilized NATO in ways he didn't expect, but it's hurting. Well, once he gets over this, it's hurting his arms sales. Pakistan, for example, is openly talking about dropping China because their substitutions, how should I put it? Their superior versions of Russian weapons are not so superior. And they think it would be best to get back to Western suppliers, which is difficult because they're broke. But it shows an interesting, change of heart. India, in the meantime, is still, trying to figure out ways to pay for stuff they've already bought from Russia. But I'm sure they're thinking too that, this Russian stuff, it may not be that good. For example, they have most of the T-90 tanks in existence. They're a major export customer, export customer for them. And he's seeing the Indians are seeing a lot of pictures of blown up T-90s, including the latest model, which is supposed to be resistant to the weapons that the Ukrainians are using. So that's already a long-term effect that the Russians are going to have to deal with. Another problem with NATO, as it were, is that in order to shift a lot of their support, monetary and otherwise, to Ukraine, they've cut back on their contributions to the World Food Aid Program. And that means that, Africa, where about 80% of the food need is, and most of the people in danger of starvation, are going to have their food supplies cut substantially. I mean, the price is going up, and there's less money to buy it. So that may be not necessarily a disaster, but it's going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of Africans. I mean, they'll save the starving, but the money just isn't there to supply all the demand. And of course, with Finland, that really blew up in his face. Sweden is still considering it, but the Finns politicians are saying we must do it immediately, as soon as possible. Now, the European Union, in the meantime, has looked at the Ukrainian application, as it were, for joining the EU, and they pointed out that Ukraine, especially in its current state, is way below the entry standards, as it were. So that has to be worked out. And on the ground, how should I put it? The battle for Ukraine between the Ukrainian forces and the Russians is heating up. The Ukrainians have developed tactics that enable them to push back the Russian advance. They pushed it back quite a bit. There is partisan activity breaking out within Russian-occupied territory. And the Russians are basically openly considering, for all intents and purposes, annexing Donbass, Crimea, the Kherson, the Kherson city area, which controls the Donetsk River, which basically controls most of the grain exports and a lot of the imports that Ukraine depends upon. So not only does Ukraine have to drive them out of Donbass, but the most important thing is on the coast, because the Russians are apparently shifting their how should I put it, their major efforts to capturing Odessa, which is the major port that the Ukrainians still have on the Black Sea. Now, right now, the the Russian Black Sea Fleet controls, the Black Sea. It's considered a war zone, so the Turks have invoked, the treaty they signed in the 1920s about who gets into the Black Sea during wartime, and that means basically nobody, especially Russians. So they're not able to bring in any more ships. Now that could get interesting because the Ukrainians have figured out how to do a number, as it were, on Russian ships. They basically now this is rumored, as it were, rumor intelligence, but apparently we knew that the NATO was flying their AWACS aircraft, inside, Poland, Romania, and what have you, and supplying the Ukrainians with intelligence, as it were, about what the Russians have in the air, where it is, etc. But apparently, an American P-8, maritime reconnaissance aircraft was operating down, I believe, in Romania. And then shortly before the Moskva was hit by the Ukrainian anti-ship missiles, the P-8 turned off its transponder and went dark. And of course, like I said, the rumor is that was done so they could go in there and basically find the Moskva, pinpoint its location, and transmit that to the Ukrainians. So the Russian complaint that the NATO was helping, the Ukrainians find their ships at sea may be true. But even if it isn't true, it's certainly possible. And we don't know how many, maritime patrol aircraft are going dark or not even going dark, and basically giving the Ukrainians a very up-to-date picture of where Russian warships are on the in the Black Sea. Now they apparently have most of their ships at sea now. After the the latest debacle, where they lost a landing craft and two of their Raptor, assault boats. They've lost most of their Raptors so far since March to the Ukrainians. They've basically gambled, as it were, and sent I think the other amphibious ships they have towards Odessa. Now, whether or not the Russians will land, whether or not they have enough guided missiles and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles to weaken the defenses of Odessa remains to be seen. I doubt if the Ukrainians are going to give it up to any amphibious assault, and now it looks rather unlikely that the Russians are going to have enough ships surviving the Ukrainian anti-ship missile attacks to get in there. Now, the Ukrainians are also asking for Harpoon missiles, which have better countermeasures than their own Neptune missiles, which are an updated copy of the Russian KH-35 anti-ship missile. And those might just be shipped in there without any announcement. And then suddenly the rest of the Black Sea Fleet disappears. Once that happens, all bets are off about, what the Ukrainians can do. At least they won't be exposed to the threat of amphibious attack anymore, or, bombardment from the sea. But at the same time, they haven't got much of a navy left. They have a few ships left, but I don't think it's enough to assert domination over the Black Sea. But that remains to be seen. Ships can be brought in through the Danube. Excuse me, light ships. Also, they might have a few left in the Caspian Sea. They have a canal that goes to the and exits in the Black Sea. Has been there for decades, and that's where they brought in one of the Raptors that have been stationed in the Caspian. It's not looking good for Mr. Putin. He basically is stating that he must have some kind of victory. He did not on the Victory Day speech. They celebrate the victory over Germany every year. He did not follow up with any call for a mass mobilization. That is apparently because the KGB, secret population survey indicated that would end disastrously. A lot of people would just flat out refuse. There's more, how shall I put it, popular opposition within inside Russia. A lot of those fires and explosions in Russian logistics facilities inside, sometimes deep inside Russia, are believed to work of anti-war Russians. There's also fires being set on recruiting stations where they try and recruit their contract soldiers, and those are apparently not Ukrainian because some of them are very deep inside of Russia. So it's not looking good, but it's not hopeless. I mean, basically, if he can hang on to the areas in Ukraine that he already holds, or makes it too expensive for the Ukrainians to take them, he might have a chance. But the Ukrainians are just as determined, if not more so, to figure out ways to take them back without, incurring a lot of casualties. I mean, Ukrainian morale has remained high because they have been taking far fewer casualties than the Russians, and the Ukrainians are aware of it. Morale, the way the morale goes might be the decisive factor in all of this.
Austin, what are your thoughts about NATO and what the Ukraine war?
Well, Jim kind of gave us a rundown on the operational situation now after initially commenting on what Sweden and Finland were up to. I think so I'll go pick that up a little bit. Just one thing, Jim, that Montreux Treaty's 1936. I mean,
I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Smidgen. Well, I mean, folks, Dunnigan and I have talked about this stuff about Turkey all the time. So I just pointed out because every once in a while we get a email from somebody saying, you guys got that wrong. Well, okay, we corrected on that. Look, Finland and Sweden just flipped, Dan, in 2014 when Russia invaded and annexed Crimea. Well, they weren't the only countries that flipped, but they they weren't blinded. They didn't have blinders on, but here it came. Suddenly, that agreement that World War II had supposedly imposed on the end of World War II on Europe, that you didn't go take territory by military aggression. It was ripped to shreds. That was that Budapest Accord of 1994 that the U.S. and Great Britain backed up. Ukraine traded its nuclear weapons, sent them to Russia for an agreement in perpetuity of the guarantee of Ukraine's territorial integrity by the Russians. And it was gone. Now, that shook NATO. NATO suddenly saw once again that it had a reason to exist. There were plenty of people in every single NATO ally, NATO country, that realized the alliance was extremely valuable. Not just the Balts, even though the Balts probably realize it more than anyone else because they are strategically protected by Article 5, which, we've flippantly called the Three Musketeers Clause, but it amounts to that. It means if you attack a NATO nation, you choose to do that, you are at war with the rest of NATO. Yes, there are all kinds of little finagling that can be done about a nation deciding whether to commit forces, but you are, as a member of the alliance, you are committed to oppose the nation invading NATO territory. Now, Finland, let's go check out the Finns and Swedes, first of all. Really, during the Cold War, despite all of the socialist leftist political garbage you would hear from Sweden, Sweden knew who the enemy was, who their enemy was. There was a lot of inside cooperation, particularly with Norway and Denmark, which are both NATO countries. The same thing went for Finland, even though Finland had to keep it, Finlandizations. Finland had to keep it very quiet, sotto voce. Very, very quiet. But you look at the Finnish defense system, it's a nation in arms, and they're armed to fight Russia, just like they did during the Winter War, and then the Second War they fought with the Russians during World War II. They know the bear is their enemy, and they know who their friends are. Their friends are not only the other Nordics, it's Western Europe, United States, Canada. 2014, they really saw no reason to continue playing continue the charade of being a neutral. They really weren't a neutral. They were threatened. Putin had been telling us for, let's see, in 2014, he'd been telling us for 15, 20, between 15 and 20 years that he thought the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. That's what he thought. And he'd already showed signs of wanting to rebuild the Russia as a great power. I've got that column up in November of 2004 that's back in the On Point archive that even talks about that. And that's how many years ago? That's 18 years ago. So the 2014 Finland and Sweden, so the die is cast. And you see, you can just go ahead and track public opinion polling in Finland and Sweden. And there was always a small faction that wanted to, quote unquote, join the West. And EU is part of the European version of joining the West, but also join the alliance. Because what you get with the alliance is a backup, a big boy, the United States, and it takes a big boy to back you up against Russia. And not only was that reflected in just political polling, you begin to see Finland and to some degree Sweden cooperating with, observer missions, training missions, and then suddenly participating in war games. You know, the Trident Juncture exercise, the one in 2018, which Strategy Page covered fairly closely, was a major exercise. There have even been NATO exercises in Finland with contingents from the U.S., Great Britain, and the other Nordics. I want to make one other comment about the history of this. The Swedes, actually, I got this confirmed from Danish sources. The Swedes had, even during the Cold War, had access through Denmark to some air control information and air identification. In other words, they were getting approved feeds of NATO air and space picture from Denmark. And it was kept quiet. Sweden benefited, and ultimately NATO benefited. Now, to move up to what's happened since February of this year, support in Finland is overwhelming. I've seen in the last month, and I wrote a column about this 2 weeks ago too, about Finland and Sweden joining NATO. But I saw figures running in Finland anywhere from 62% to almost 75% of the people saying it's time to get busy, get serious, and apply to join NATO. And two smaller parties and some politicians that had been opposed to it had publicly changed their attitude. It was like, including I read a interview, and I don't remember the man's name, but he says, we've got to be realistic about what the kind of threat that Putin and Russia poses. And so you've seen the switch. Again, it wasn't immediate. You can see it going on since March of 2014, which is why Finland this week said we want to join. Now, in Sweden, you'd seen the same effect. It hasn't been as the numbers weren't as startling as in Finland, but it's certainly well over 50%, low 60s. But the Swedish parties that had traditionally, and they were absolutely wedded to neutrality, have changed their positions, and the public statement. Really, it was I think in April, even though there'd been a lot of leaks that it suggested they were going to say this, is if Finland decides to join, we're going to join. Well, you've seen the Finns move, and I strongly suspect, based on everything I read, we'll shortly see the Swedes move. Now, joining NATO is usually a slow process, but both Sweden and Finland have military establishments, Jim can talk about this, that are NATO quality. They bring a great deal to the alliance. They have modern economies. They're both democracies, and there's supposedly, again, this is rumant, like Jim says, but it's reasonable rumant, that most NATO nations are prepared to fast track them. First, because of the threat posed by Putin, and second, because they want it. And really, the deep third, which is not insignificant, they've been cooperating with NATO for decades. So that's it. Jim started off this strategy talk by saying, Putin's brought it on himself. I think we've said that in about 4 or 5 podcasts about Russia and Ukraine. But this is a strategic defeat for Putin. NATO's coming to get us. He's been saying, what a threat. Well, it's his own actions that's strengthened and enlarged NATO, and then added a 1,300 kilometer front that Russia's going to have to worry about, and that's up north, and it's got a lot of very difficult terrain in it. I'm talking about the Finnish front. So that's what NATO's expansion. Plus NATO's morale, Russia's morale has sunk. NATO, again, as I said, not to repeat myself, but it now knows why it exists.
One thing I'm curious about, Jim, is the NATO countries have been feeding weapons into the Ukrainians. That's drawing down our stockpiles, correct? And those are all going to need to be replaced.
Yes, we've covered that regularly because it is a interesting situation. It's called, replenishing the war reserve. The war reserve, that is, the quantity of supplies, especially ammunition, that will get the forces, active duty forces through combat for 30 to 60 days before the factories back home can tool up to replace the ammunition and other expenditures. Well, that was put to a very realistic test. And even during the Cold War, we realized, especially with a lot of the missiles and, the high-tech stuff, you can't mobilize as quickly as you did during World War II. And, you need bigger reserves, but bigger war reserves are expensive, and they're unpopular with legislatures, especially the American Congress. You can't really score any re-election points, appropriating a sufficiently large war reserve. And, most politicians realize if there was a major war, which even now is unlikely, and the mistake of not building up those war reserves comes home to roost, a lot of them will just say, hey, who knew, right? And, depending on how good their PR people are, they might get away with it. But again, that's just politics 101. Unless something's going to get your votes, you kick it down the road, and you can point to a lot of programs, necessary programs, essential programs, things that should have been done that didn't get done because the politicians, the elected representatives of the people, realized that they could just come up with a way, form a commission. Whenever you hear the government talking about forming a commission to study a problem, kiss a solution goodbye, because a commission is another way of smothering the problem until it dies of lack of oxygen. But this is very real and immediate. And the only saving grace we have is it's not us who are using up the munitions at a rapid pace. Now, this has caused the manufacturers to smell, blood like a vampire does. And they're saying we can do it, and they have an opportunity to do it. And Congress is under an enormous amount of pressure to pay for them to do it. That's an unusual configuration of events that enable you to test the ability of U.S. munitions and weapons manufacturers to actually meet a wartime demand. The last time we had something like that was in the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, where the Israelis, we had access to their actual, expenditures and what have you. And, the Israelis' comment was, which was nothing, revealing, was, man, this is a lot heavier than we expected. And of course, NATO realized it's a whole lot heavier than even we expected. So that's when in the 70s and periodically after that, the issue of adequate war reserves came up. Now, I think it's Northrop is manufacturing that missile. They say they can do it because they've kept producing them, even though the United States hasn't bought any of the Javelin missile. The United States hasn't bought any for about 18 years. But production has still been fairly intense because it's become a very popular export item. And this is basically the saving grace. I mean, it's been around since the early 90s, I believe, and it first proved itself in the hands of the special forces, keeping the Iraqis out of the Kurdish territories. And ever since then, it's basically proved the most effective anti-tank guided missile against any kind of tank. And of course, there've been upgrades. Now, the Ukrainians didn't get the latest upgrade that could penetrate top armor, reactive armor, and what have you. But apparently, they took out the latest version of the T-90, which has all those enhancements. Not just better protection on the top of the turret, which is most vulnerable. Most of the anti-tank guided missiles use top attack. In other words, they fly over the tank and then boom, detonate a shaped charge downwards, going through the thinnest armor. And of course, for Russian tanks, that's a kill shot, because the Russians don't safeguard the armor, the ready ammunition in the turret the way Western tanks do. I guess it's getting to the point where the Ukrainians are getting the latest upgrade of the Javelin. There's other missiles. The Swedes produced the NLIW, which is basically a mini Javelin. It's only got a maximum range of about 600 meters, compared to 4 times that with the Javelin. But it's a lot cheaper, much cheaper. And apparently maybe a lot easier to make. Now the Britons are making most of them.
Jim, just a correction, because I know some of the readers have commented about this before. It's Raytheon and Lockheed.
Okay, like I said, I wasn't sure. They also had to merge together, in my eyes. But anyway, all the manufacturers of munitions, and this includes most of the majors, are sensing that here's an opportunity to be heroes and to test in real time and under realistic conditions their ability to replenish wartime losses. Now, the Ukrainians are also providing an example of innovative and previously unused tactics. I mean, one of the things that is impressing the Pentagon is SpaceX and Starlink and Elon Musk. I mean, basically, he founded those operations. He owns them, and he's the guy who unilaterally ordered. On the day the Russians invaded, he says, all right, I'm turning Starlink on over Ukraine. Within days, he had 500 of the kits, which is basically a small dish and a special modem so you can hook it up to a computer. And he demonstrated that without government assistance, he can patch things. He was able to defeat numerous Russian attempts to jam or to disrupt Starlink. But Starlink has become so robust that it's become a key part of another, innovation which is alien to the West. They developed their own fire control system, artillery fire control system. Something most people aren't aware of is the United States Army developed in the 1930s this this system of basically calling in artillery and naval gunfire from all guns within range for a timed, time on target. In other words, to hit a target at the same time. The German, German POWs, their observation of all that was that it's unfair, but so that must work. Since then, that system has been degraded, even though they've automated the parts of it with programmable calculators and mini computers. Because during the war on terror, even before that, the lawfare intervened, and the Army had to basically insert a judicial judgment phase. So while during World War II, they got the time between the fire request and delivery down to 5 minutes from about 20 minutes early in the war. It expanded to about an hour now because you have to involve the lawyers, and they're usually in Washington. Now the politicians thought, well, we can make this work. We have this global communications, satellite stuff, what have you. But there's no predicting, how long the bureaucrats will debate before saying yes, you can fire. Now this irritated the troops enormously because while they were waiting for the fire order, they were still under fire by the enemy. The special forces found ways to, get around it until they were discovered, and they had to find a new loophole. But for the regular troops, it was a great source of frustration and additional casualties. In fact, there were even complaints from Afghan civilians that when they asked the American troops, why didn't you attack the Taliban when they were attacking our village? And they say, well, we had to get permission from Washington. And they looked at them incredulously, and they said, why? Because we might take some casualties? And they said, yeah, basically, no civilian casualties. He says, and they pointed out that if they had gotten the fire and they lost a few civilians, it would have been far fewer civilian losses than if the Taliban won the battle. So, I mean, that's one of those things that is going to be spotlighted, as it were, with the Ukrainian situation. The Ukrainians basically have a problem with the Russians turning their firepower on the cities, on the civilian population. The Russians found out that with Starlink and this the GIS, the basically the custom-made fire control system, which can deliver fire within 30 seconds of the fire request. There's no slowdowns, waiting for permission. If somebody on the battlefield finds a target, they hit it. Now, where that hurt the Russians the most was their artillery. One of the things we sent in the latest package was Fire Control Firefinder, the latest version of that. That's a battle-tested. The first version was used in Afghanistan and Iraq. It had some problems. They were fixed. So it's basically a combat-proven, as it were, fire control radar. The Ukrainians also have some old Soviet-era stuff, which they still use and in some cases still make. But the Firefinder is much more efficient. It's easier to network, et cetera, et cetera. And so when the Russians get into a pitched battle with the Ukrainian forces, and they open up with their artillery, which, by the way, still operates in large units. I mean, at least battalions, 12, 18 guns, or brigades of several battalions. And they're clumped together. The Ukrainians wiped them out. Actually, they started doing this before 2022. They started developing this capability after 2014. But when Elon Musk got in there with Starlink and kept making improvements, some of them simply at the request, upgrades, as it were, at the request of the Ukrainians, it developed into a potent counter battery. In other words, firing on the enemy's artillery tool. Now, the other thing that what's Musk getting out of all this? Well, I mean, he's got a lot of non-paying customers in Ukraine, but after it's all over, he's going to have a lot of paying customers. He's got plans to expand the Starlink network from 2,000 now. It's basically in the beta stage when this was going on. There were only a few hundred users around the world who were basically testing it, and the reports were good. So that's one reason why in late 2021, the Ukrainians were asking Starlink for early access to it. And Musk knew about this, and when the Russians actually invaded, he says, all right, let's make up for lost time. But what he's been doing is making Starlink more efficient in hostile areas, not in wartime hostile areas, but in areas like China or Russia, where Russia wants to control access to the internet. And he's basically got it. Next thing you'll hear from him is he's accepting, cryptocurrency for payment, because basically it costs you about $500 for the basic starter kit. That's the dish, which can be easily hidden. Throw a tarp over it, whatever, and it'll give you basically non-censorable, non-government controlled internet access, very high speed. And this is more of a threat to Russia and China than, the Ukrainian use of it for fire control. So, Musk is altruistic, but sometimes, fortune favors those who are doing good deeds. And he's got a chance to develop and improve Starlink under very adverse conditions. So he's now planning to expand it to 42,000 of these mini satellites. These are about 500 pounds each. And basically, the more of them you have up there, the more difficult it is to try and run an anti-satellite campaign. In fact, it is now. 2,000 is more than China, or Russia could handle. But, the initial goal is about 10,000, but he's looking at 42,000. Now, the reason he needs more is because he's expecting more demand. And he's expecting more, how should I put it, shadow demand, as it were, from China and Russia. And the Chinese and Russians have already shown that they're willing to pay hard money, to get access to the world internet that isn't being censored by Russia and especially China. It also means, there's a lot of countries where it's not so much government interference, but simply no access at all. Africa, parts of Asia. And that's where they detected a big market. And what's going on in Ukraine is basically giving him a major, marketing coup, because here he's demonstrating that it really works. It works even if your local government or gangsters and whatever are looking to interfere. And it's basically going to revolutionize worldwide use of the internet, as well as making counter battery fire more effective.
Austin?
Only I get back to the NATO component of this, is that I said this, and Jim alluded to it as well. The alliance has gone through, Dan, at least 3 periods where it was critics within the alliance said it's useless, NATO is dead. And of course, the most evident example of that was after 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The alliance has shown real resilience, not simply because it's a military alliance. Even the poorest of the poor NATO nations are better off and virtually all aspects of life, then several of the areas Jim just mentioned that are shut off from effective access to the internet. Even you try to compare Turkey to some of these other places is a mistake, because it's porous. It's internet porous and information porous. Try to compare the new Balkan members. There is no comparison. They have access now, and that's attractive, Dan, to be engaged in it's attractive to the people, the political groups that the United States and Western Europe need as allies. So I'm going to give a little rah-rah to some of the externalities to NATO as well, and what Musk is doing, and what Jim was discussing, is an example of what freedom and free market can do. I had a column about 6 weeks ago, because there have been a couple of other wealthy Americans that have provided use their resources to help Ukraine, not just raising money for humanitarian aid, but the individual from North Carolina that bought a million rounds of ammunition on his own, and I later learned arranged to have that ammunition shipped at no cost to the American taxpayer and no cost to Ukraine. He got individuals to donate to help fly it over there. And yes, there had to be some government approval, like, moving U.S. weapons and war material through private resources. But he had several congressmen who backed him up, including one from his own state, and it was bipartisan. Small story, but really it's not a small story. It's reflected in what the U.S. And a free country can do. One other, Jim was talking about the problem of maintaining sufficient war stocks in the United States and every democracy, where that's not doing us any good. I think a contrarian argument, and Jim started to touch on it, can be made now if you look at 1973, and you also look at how valuable those war stocks are in a crisis like Ukraine. And as Jim pointed out, we don't have our soldiers on the ground or our planes in the air doing the fighting. We're able to back up, in this case, the victim with very, very useful cutting-edge weapons. So make the argument to Congress now, look how valuable that is. How many divisions, quote unquote, measured in ground division equivalents, is a adequate war stockage worth? And adequate, not only in terms of being able to supply the United States and its immediate allies, but potential allies. And that might be a good column. I might write that.
Well, that wraps us up today. And we'll talk about more aspects of the Ukraine war in the future, I'm sure. So we'll see you next time, gentlemen.
Take care.